They say the people who love you the most would never hurt you. I used to believe that. I used to hold on to it the way you hold on to something in the dark. Not because you can see it, but because letting go feels worse than anything. Then I found out my own parents had opened a $47,000 line of credit in my name without a single conversation, a single warning, a single moment of asking. Not borrowed, not discussed, stolen. While I was in Atlanta working 60-hour weeks building a financial life I was proud of, my family was in Portugal spending money that didn't exist. Money that, it turned out, was mine. I couldn't believe it. And yet the evidence was right there, cold and documented and devastating. My sister's wedding was supposed to be the event of the year. A private estate outside Cascais, wine estate atmosphere, marble, 200 guests, a man with an inherited fortune and a charming accent. What it actually was, what none of us knew until it was too late, was a performance built entirely on fraud. The groom was a con man, the money was stolen, and the name on the contract holding everything together? Mine. I had been lied to, cheated out of my own financial identity, and set up to take a fall on foreign soil, all by the people who raised me. The truth, when it came, didn't come slowly. It came all at once, at 2 a.m., in 53 missed calls that changed everything. Here's what shocked me most, not the betrayal itself, as devastating as it was. What shocked me was the strategy behind it. This wasn't a panic decision. This wasn't desperation in the moment. This was planned over 8 months, quietly, carefully, while I was sending birthday cards and calling on holidays and believing, in my most naive corner, that maybe this family was something worth holding on to. They had used my self-worth as collateral. They had shamed me without my knowledge. They had humiliated me in a way so precise and so personal that it could only have been done by people who knew exactly where I was most vulnerable. And then, they called me to pay for it. What happened next is what I want to tell you about. Because the call I made instead of sending that wire transfer changed everything. I still remember the exact moment I realized my family had built an entire fantasy and expected me to smile through it. My sister Vivienne had been planning this wedding for over a year, talking about it like it was some kind of royal coronation. The venue? A private estate outside Cascais, Portugal. Vineyard views, marble fountains, the whole thing. I couldn't believe the scale of it. And me? I was in Atlanta, grinding through 60-hour work weeks as a senior financial analyst, watching from a distance as the money somehow kept flowing. The groom's name was Sebastian Hartwell, or at least that's what he told everyone. He had this polished accent, a wardrobe that screamed old money, and a story about an inheritance tied up in overseas accounts. My family bought every word of it. My mother called him God's gift to this family. My father shook his hand like he'd just signed a business deal. And Vivienne? She was completely swept away, glowing like she'd won something. The whole thing felt like family drama dressed up in silk and champagne. What nobody wanted to talk about, what I kept asking about, was the money. How were they paying for this? The estate alone had to be running 6 figures. Catering for 200 guests, imported flowers, a live orchestra. When I asked my mother directly, she laughed and said, "Don't worry about it, Jordan. You always overthink everything." That dismissal stung more than I let on. I'd grown up being the responsible one, the one who never asked for anything, and somehow that had turned into me being invisible. The betrayal hadn't even started yet, but something in my gut already knew it was coming. I was not invited to help plan. I was not asked for my opinion. I was only sent a formal invitation, like a stranger. My sister and I had never been close, not really. She was the golden child, the one who got the attention, the praise, the second chances. I was the one who left home at 17 on a scholarship and never looked back. Our family dynamic had always been lopsided, but I told myself I'd made peace with it. Standing in my Atlanta apartment, Staring at that invitation printed on thick cream paper, I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a performance. And I didn't know yet what role they'd cast me in. The weeks leading up to the ceremony, my phone buzzed constantly with updates I hadn't asked for. Photos of the venue, videos of Vivian in her dress. My mom voice noting me about the seating chart like we were best friends. It was the most attention they'd paid me in years, and I was naive enough, for just a moment, to wonder if things were changing. Maybe this wedding was going to bring us closer. Maybe I'd been holding on to old wounds for too long. I almost let myself believe it. And that almost, is what made what came next so devastating. Something still didn't add up. The numbers, the scale, the speed of it all. My analytical mind wouldn't let it go. I'd spent years reading financial patterns for a living, and this had all the markers of something unstable. But families aren't balance sheets, and love isn't a risk assessment. So I pushed the feeling down and told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself it was just a wedding. I had no idea I was about to be pulled into the middle of a betrayal I never saw coming. I was asleep when it started. It was just past 2 a.m., Atlanta time, which meant early morning in Portugal, and my phone was face down on my nightstand the way I always kept it on weekends. I hadn't gone to the wedding in person. A last-minute work emergency had kept me grounded, and part of me had felt quietly relieved about that. But relief has a short shelf life. I rolled over, grabbed my phone half asleep, and stared at the screen for a long moment before my brain could process what I was seeing. 53 missed calls. I couldn't believe it. The calls were from my mother, my father, my cousin Renata, my Aunt Dolores, and 2 numbers I didn't even recognize. There were voice messages stacked on top of each other, each one more frantic than the last. My mother's voice was barely recognizable, high-pitched, breathless, cracking at the edges. "Jordan, pick up. Something happened. He's gone. Sebastian is gone." My father's message was just silence, then heavy breathing, then the line went dead. I sat up in my bed, heart hammering, trying to piece together what I was hearing. Gone. What did gone mean? By the 3rd voice message, the picture started forming. Sebastian, the charming, well-dressed, wealthy Sebastian, had disappeared sometime after midnight. The money envelopes from the wedding guests, the gifts, a cash box kept in the bridal suite, all of it, gone with him. I knew he was a con man. What I didn't know, what I still don't, is whether my parents hired him or whether he saw my family's desperation and took the cash as a final exit. What I do know is that the celebration had collapsed into pure chaos. Guests were screaming. My sister was inconsolable on the floor of the venue. Someone had called the local police, and my family, instead of waiting for help, had started panicking in the worst possible way. Renata was sending frantic texts between voice notes, details spilling out faster than I could process. The words, "they broke something," hit me like a punch. My stomach dropped. I called my mother back immediately. She answered on the first ring, and what came out of her mouth was not a greeting. It was a flood. She was speaking so fast I had to ask her to slow down 3 times. Apparently, in the chaos following Sebastian's disappearance, my father had shoved a decorative urn off a pedestal in the estate's main hall. Someone from Sebastian's party had punched a wall and cracked a century-old tile mosaic, and Vivian, still in her wedding dress, had thrown a centerpiece through a leaded glass window. The estate managers had immediately locked the gates and called the authorities. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. This was an international incident. I was sitting in my kitchen by now, barefoot on the cold tile, writing things down on a notepad because my brain needed the structure. Sebastian, missing. Cash, stolen. Family, detained for questioning. Venue, damaged. I kept circling that last phrase, detained for questioning, as in they were not free to leave, as in there were police involved. My pulse was steady. Years of high-pressure work had trained me to stay calm when everything around me was collapsing. But underneath that calm, something sharper was building. a question I couldn't silence. How did this wedding even happen? Who paid for all of this? Because I already knew my family didn't have that kind of money. And that question, that single quiet question, was about to tear everything open. By sunrise, I had the full picture, or at least I thought I did. My family was being held at the regional station near the estate, outside Cascais, under preliminary investigation. The charges being discussed were property destruction, disorderly conduct, and failure to pay outstanding balances owed to the venue. The estate management was not interested in apologies. They wanted $28,000 immediately to cover the damage to the historic property and the remaining unpaid balance on the rental contract. 28,000 euros. I wrote the number down and stared at it. That's not pocket change. That's not something you fix with a phone call. My mother called again, and this time her tone had shifted from hysterical to something more calculated. She wasn't crying anymore. She was explaining, slowly, carefully, that the situation was serious, that the police were not playing around, that my father could face real criminal charges if this wasn't resolved quickly. "This is a historic building, Jordan," she said, like I needed the context. "They don't take these things lightly over here." I listened. I asked questions. I took notes. And I noticed something that made my skin go cold. She kept saying the contract, without explaining what contract, or whose name was on it. She kept saying, "We need to handle this," without saying who "we" was. The image of my family being escorted into a Portuguese station, my mother in her mother-of-the-bride gown, my father in his rented suit, Vivian still reportedly in her wedding dress, would have been almost cinematic if it weren't so deeply shameful. I had spent my entire adult life trying to build something solid, something respectable. I had a career, a reputation, a financial record I'd protected carefully for over a decade. While I was doing that, my family had been performing a life they couldn't afford. And now the performance had collapsed, and the stage was on fire, and somehow I could feel the heat from Atlanta. This was the most shocking thing I'd witnessed, and the worst was still coming. What broke me wasn't the chaos. It was the silence around the important things. Nobody was explaining how a family with no savings had booked an estate that charged 5 figures per night. Nobody was explaining how the catering, the florals, the music, the travel, all of it, had been funded. My family was humiliated in a foreign country, yes, but they were also being very careful about what they told me. And I've been in enough financial investigations to know what selective information looks like. It looks exactly like this. Someone had signed something. Someone had borrowed something. And the longer nobody said my name, the more certain I became that they were about to. The Portuguese authorities were not the kind to negotiate. I spoke briefly with a former client contact who dealt with Americans in legal trouble abroad, and she was blunt. If the fines weren't paid within 48 hours and the property damage wasn't settled, my father was looking at formal charges with real consequences in the EU, travel restrictions, international flags on his name, complications that wouldn't simply go away. My family had turned a wedding into a legal crisis on foreign soil. And as I poured my second cup of coffee and watched the Atlanta sunrise through my window, something cold and clarifying settled over me. I needed to find out exactly what they'd done, because I had a feeling this wasn't just their problem. I didn't go looking for it. That's the part I need you to understand. I didn't go digging, didn't snoop, didn't hack into anything. The truth found me because the truth always does, eventually. I called my bank that morning to flag any unusual international activity, just as a precaution. Standard procedure for me. I was careful about my finances the way some people are careful about their health. The representative pulled up my account, paused for a beat too long, and then said words I will never forget. "Ms. Whitfield, I'm seeing a line of credit opened approximately 8 months ago. Is that something you authorized?" I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. No, I had not authorized anything. The line of credit was for $47,000. It had been opened in my name, using my social security number, my address, my credit history, and a forged signature. They had submitted my entire financial profile as the guarantor for the event, approved through paperless processing that I never had reason to check. All vendor communication had gone through my mother's email, but the guarantor profile was mine, which is exactly why the estate never once contacted me directly before the event. The funds had been drawn down almost entirely over 6 months. Deposits for the estate, vendor guarantees, catering contracts, travel. My parents hadn't stumbled into fraud. They had engineered it. I had been cheated by the people who were supposed to love me most. The betrayal was so complete it almost had a kind of terrible elegance to it. I sat on my kitchen floor, actually on the floor, back against the cabinets, and let myself feel it for exactly 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the clock. Then I stood up, because that is what I do. That is what I have always done while everyone else in my family fell apart. I got up, I poured cold water over my face, and I started making a list. Because when someone steals your identity to fund a fake wedding in a foreign country, you don't have the luxury of a breakdown. You have to be smarter than the people who betrayed you. And in that moment, every piece of family drama, every eye roll, every dismissal, it all started to make devastating sense. The pieces were everywhere once I knew where to look. The reason they'd kept me at a distance from the planning. The reason my mother changed the subject whenever I asked about costs. The reason nobody had ever, not once, asked me for financial help directly, because they didn't need to ask. They'd already helped themselves. They didn't want luxury alone. They wanted status. They wanted 200 guests to believe they were a family of consequence, and they used my name to buy that illusion. I had been their silent, invisible resource, and they had drained me without ever looking me in the eye. The anger came later. First came the grief, quiet, cold, and very specific. I wasn't grieving the money. I was grieving the version of my family I had clung to even when the evidence told me to let go. I had told myself for years that we were just complicated, that every family had dysfunction, that the distance between us was normal, healthy even. But there's a line between complicated and criminal. And my family hadn't just crossed it. They'd erased it entirely, forged my name on it, and mailed it to Portugal. The shamed feeling came in waves. But underneath the shame was something much more dangerous to them. Clarity. And I was just getting started. My mother called at 9:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd already decided I was going to document every single conversation from that point forward. She didn't open with an apology. She didn't acknowledge what I'd found. She opened with a statement, calm and direct, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed. "Jordan, we need you to wire the money. The contract is in your name. If you don't handle this, you're the one who's going to be in trouble." I let the silence stretch for a full 5 seconds before I responded. "I know what you did, Mom." Another silence. Then, "We did what we had to do." What followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. And I say that not with bitterness, but with the cold recognition of someone who had just spent the night reading about identity theft law. My mother ran through every script in the playbook. First, the guilt. "We raised you. Everything we did for this family." Then, the threat. "The Portuguese authorities are going to come after you, Jordan. Your name is on everything." Then, the pivot to victimhood. "How can you do this to us? We're your parents. We're in a foreign country." And underneath all of it, the implication that I had no choice, that I owed them, that paying was not just practical, it was my obligation as a daughter. The word justice flashed in my mind so clearly I almost said it out loud. Because what she was describing, me wiring money to clean up a fraud they had committed in my name, wasn't justice. It was the opposite. It was a continuation of the same dynamic that had defined my entire childhood. Jordan will handle it. Jordan is responsible. Jordan won't make a scene. I had spent 20 years being the dependable one, And they had taken that dependability and turned it into a weapon against me. They didn't see a daughter when they looked at me. They saw a line of credit with a good payment history. And the shame of that realization hit me like a wave, quickly followed by something colder and stronger. My father got on the phone next. His voice was low and controlled in a way my mother's wasn't. He was the strategic one, always had been. He said, "You need to think about what happens to your career if this becomes a legal mess. Your name is already attached to the contract. If the estate presses charges, it doesn't matter what you say. It's going to look bad for you." That was the moment I understood clearly. This was not a cry for help. This was a coordinated strategy. They had thought about my pressure points, my career, my reputation, my carefully built financial life. And they were pressing them deliberately. They had backstabbed me, and now they were using the knife as leverage. I said very little for the rest of that call. I asked 2 questions, the name of the officer handling the case, and the direct line to the station, and I wrote them both down. My mother took my silence as consideration. She said, "I knew you'd come through for us, Jordan. I knew it." I didn't correct her. I just said I'd call her back, and I hung up. I sat for a moment with my notepad in my lap, looking at those 2 pieces of information I'd just obtained, because I wasn't going to wire anything. I wasn't going to pay for a fraud I didn't commit. And the call I was about to make wasn't to a bank. It was going to change everything. I had the captain's name, Rodrigo Fonseca, and I had the direct line to the regional station that my mother had given me, thinking I was going to call on her behalf. She thought I was going to explain, charm, negotiate, pay. She thought I was going to do what I had always done, absorb the damage and protect everyone else. I picked up my phone and I dialed. But what I said when Captain Fonseca answered was nothing close to what my family expected. I said, clearly and calmly, in the steadiest voice I've ever used, "Captain, my name is Jordan Whitfield. I'm calling from Atlanta, Georgia. I want to report identity theft." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "Go ahead." And I went ahead. I told him everything. The line of credit, the forged signature, the estate rental in my name, the vendor contracts, the timeline. I told him I had documentation going back 8 months. I told him I had not been in Portugal at any point during the wedding, that I could provide flight records, work attendance logs, and bank statements showing I was in the United States for every transaction in question. I told him I was the victim, not the responsible party. And as I spoke, I could hear something shifting on his end. The careful, measured attention of a professional who understood exactly what he was being told. Captain Fonseca, the supervising officer on duty, was not unkind. He was professional, precise, and clearly experienced with situations more complicated than a family falling apart at a wedding. He explained that my formal report would need to be filed in writing, that it would need to be accompanied by documentation, and that once submitted, it would change the legal classification of the case significantly. He also told me, and I want you to understand what this meant, that the people currently under preliminary investigation at his station were no longer just guests involved in a property incident. They were now potential subjects of a fraud investigation. The entire legal weight of the situation had just rotated on its axis. My family had created this trap, and I had just stepped out of it. I didn't feel triumph. Not yet. What I felt was something closer to grief mixed with precision, like a surgeon who loves the patient but has to make the cut anyway. My family had committed a crime against me, a real crime with real legal consequences, and the decision I'd just made was not cruel. It was the only honest response to what they'd done. They had used my name. They had used my history. They had used my self-worth as collateral. And the only way to reclaim any of that, to stand up for my own dignity, was to tell the truth loudly enough that it couldn't be buried. So that's exactly what I did. Loudly, clearly, on record. My phone rang 4 times in the hour after that call. I didn't answer any of them. There would be time for conversations later, with lawyers, with investigators, with my own therapist probably. But not with my family. Not yet. Because here's the thing about people who use emotional blackmail. They only have power over you as long as you're afraid of their reaction. The moment you stop performing for them, the moment you make one clear, strategic move instead of one emotionally reactive one, the whole dynamic breaks. I had broken it. And as I set my phone face down on the counter and took a slow breath, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like myself. I felt like I was finally reclaiming something that had always been mine. The next call I made was to my bank's fraud department. And I want to be specific about this, because this is the part where most people freeze, and I almost did too. Discovering that someone you love has stolen your identity is not like discovering a stranger did it. It's layered. There's the financial crisis, yes, but underneath it there's this crushing personal betrayal that makes you want to hesitate, to soften it, to maybe not pull every thread, because pulling every thread means making it real. I pulled every thread. I reported the fraudulent line of credit, flagged every transaction, and filed a formal dispute with documentation. Every single one. The fraud specialist I spoke with, a woman named Denise, patient and thorough, walked me through the full picture of the damage. The $47,000 line of credit had been drawn down to $44,800, used largely to secure vendor deposits and guarantee contracts for the event before Sebastian ever ran with the cash at the wedding itself. The interest accruing for 8 months was already significant. My credit score had taken a measurable hit. But here's what Denise told me that changed the texture of the whole situation. Because I was reporting this as identity theft with a police report number and a formal complaint already filed abroad, the bank had a clear legal pathway to dispute every charge. The damage was real, but it was not permanent. I could fight it. I spent the rest of that day on the phone and at my computer, building a documentation file so thorough it would make an attorney cry with admiration. Flight records showing my location for every relevant date. Work logs, badge swipes, time-stamped emails, screenshots of every communication I'd had, and hadn't had, with my family around the wedding. Bank statements. The formal complaint number from Captain Fonseca. I had been a financial analyst for 11 years, and the one thing that career had given me was the ability to reconstruct a paper trail under pressure. I reconstructed mine with everything I had. And what emerged from that reconstruction was not just my innocence, it was my armor. The fraud freeze was in place by noon. My credit was locked down across all 3 bureaus. No new lines could be opened in my name. The fraudulent accounts were flagged and frozen pending investigation. It felt like watching someone board up windows before a storm. Too late to stop what had already happened, but necessary to prevent anything further. I sat back in my chair and looked at the timeline I'd built on my screen. All the dates and numbers and documents lined up in order, and something clicked into place in my mind. This wasn't just about the money. This was about whether I was going to let this family erase everything I had built. And the answer, every single fiber of it, was no. What I felt that evening was not anger exactly. It was something more useful. It was resolve. The kind of resolve that comes not from fury, but from clarity, from knowing exactly where you stand and exactly what you are willing to protect. My dignity was not negotiable. My financial future was not a resource for anyone else to tap without my knowledge, and the idea that I would wire money to cover a crime committed against me, the vengeance I wanted wasn't violent or dramatic. It was legal, documented, and airtight. I had spent my whole life being the responsible one. It turned out responsibility, when directed at yourself, is the most powerful thing you can own. They called from unknown numbers when I stopped answering the ones I knew. My Aunt Dolores left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I listened to all of it once, then archived it in a folder labeled Evidence. She used the word betrayal to describe what I was doing. The irony of that was so sharp I almost laughed. I had been backstabbed, identity stolen, signature forged, credit weaponized, and the family narrative was already being rewritten so that I was the one who had broken the code. That's how it works in families like mine. The person who refuses to keep quiet becomes the villain. My cousin Renata texted me something long and impassioned about blood being thicker than water and how what I was doing would destroy the family. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, slowly, and I noticed something. Not once in her message did she acknowledge what had been done to me. Not once did she say the words identity theft, or forged signature, or even, I'm sorry this happened. It was all about what I was doing to them, as if my response to a crime were the crime itself. That kind of logic only works when you've been trained since childhood to put everyone else's feelings before your own. I had been, and I was done. The blocking happened in stages over the course of 3 days, not impulsively, but deliberately. My mother first, then my father, then Vivian, who had the audacity to send me a message that read, I didn't know, I promise, without a single question about how I was. Then the extended family, one by one, as they revealed through their messages that their loyalty was to silence rather than to truth. Each block felt like sealing a door, not in anger, but in the recognition that some doors should have been sealed a long time ago. My self-worth was not a debate. My dignity was not up for a family vote. And I had the paperwork to prove it. What surprised me was how quiet it got. I'd spent so long assuming that the noise of my family, the calls, the drama, the demands, was just the texture of having a family at all, that it was normal to feel anxious when your phone rang, normal to brace yourself before reading a message from your mother, normal to calculate the cost of every conversation before you had it. And then the noise stopped. And what filled the silence wasn't loneliness. It was something I didn't have a word for immediately, but I recognized it from somewhere deep and old. It was peace, not happiness, not relief. Just the flat, quiet weight of a boundary that was finally holding. There were moments, especially late at night, where I felt the grief of it. I want to be honest about that. Grief doesn't wait for you to decide someone deserves it. It comes anyway, for the idea of what a family should be, for the love you gave that was never received the way you meant it. I grieved the mother I had wanted, the sister who could have been a friend, the father who could have been proud of me for who I was, instead of what I could provide. But grief and regret are not the same thing. I did not regret a single decision I had made, and for the first time in a very long time, the person I felt most loyal to was myself. It was a Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks after everything. I was up before my alarm, I almost always am, and I made black coffee the way I always do. No sugar, no milk, and I sat by the window in my Atlanta apartment and watched the sun come up over the city. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No music, no revelation, no crying. Just me and a cup of coffee and the slow, pale light coming over the skyline. And I thought, I'm okay. Not happy, not fixed, not healed. Just okay. And for the first time in a long time, okay felt like enough. The legal process was moving quietly in the background. The bank dispute was progressing. Captain Fonseca's office had sent formal documentation confirming my report. The fraudulent accounts were being unwound one by one. My credit score, which had dipped into territory that made me wince, was already showing early signs of recovery. The financial damage was real but reversible. Every analyst in me knew that. Time and documentation could fix a credit report. What it couldn't fix, what no legal process in the world could address, was the specific kind of loss that comes from discovering the people who raised you saw you as a resource rather than a person. I thought about the wedding, the one I hadn't attended, that had never really been what it appeared to be. Vivian, in her white dress in a Portuguese estate she didn't pay for, marrying a man who wasn't who he said he was, surrounded by family who had quietly bankrupted their own daughter to make the fantasy possible. It was a perfect picture of everything my family had always been. Beautiful on the surface, hollow underneath. The karma of it, Sebastian disappearing into the night with the cash, the police, the public humiliation, felt less like justice and more like inevitability. You can't build something real on a lie. It doesn't hold. What I kept coming back to, sitting there with my coffee going cold, was the question of self-worth. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about growing up in a family that uses you. You internalize the equation. You start to believe, somewhere very quiet and very deep, that your value is tied to your usefulness. That love is conditional on performance, that you have to earn your place at the table again and again, and that the moment you stop producing, the moment you stop being useful, the love will dry up. And you spend years trying to disprove that equation, working harder, achieving more, being more responsible, not knowing that you're not disproving it at all. You're confirming it, because the table was never going to welcome you. It was always going to take from you. The most expensive thing I lost in all of this was not the $44,800. It was not the credit score damage. It was not even the time and energy I spent building the legal case. The most expensive thing I lost was the last remaining version of the story I'd been telling myself. That my family was complicated but loving, difficult but mine. I gave up that story on a Tuesday morning in Atlanta with a cup of black coffee and a window full of early light. And in the space where that story used to live, something quieter and sturdier took its place. Not bitterness, not vengeance, not even justice exactly. Just the clear, solid knowledge that I was enough, that I had always been enough, and that anyone who couldn't see that was not my problem to carry anymore. Here I am now, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with black coffee and a quiet apartment and a life I built entirely by myself. And I want to ask you something. Because if you've made it this far in this story, I don't think it's by accident. I think some part of what I shared today landed somewhere familiar. Maybe you've been the responsible one, the invisible one, the one who was always expected to hold it together while everyone else got to fall apart. Maybe your family drama looked different. Maybe it wasn't identity theft or a fake wedding in Portugal. But maybe you know the specific weight of loving people who treat your love like a resource. If that's you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are in your story. Have you already made the cut? Are you still in the middle of it, still trying to figure out where your loyalty ends and your self-preservation begins? Have you ever been financially exploited by someone you trusted? And if so, did you fight back or absorb it? There's no wrong answer here. This is a space for honesty, and I mean that. Your experience matters. Your story deserves to be told. And I promise you, whatever you're carrying, you are not the only one carrying it. And if this video made you feel something, if it stirred up anger, recognition, grief, or even just a kind of exhausted relief that someone finally said the quiet part out loud, then please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because this is not the last story we're going to tell here. We go deep. We go honest. We talk about the things that families whisper about, and the world tells you to keep private. The manipulation, the financial abuse, the golden child dynamic. The way love gets weaponized in places it should be safe. Every week, we pull back another curtain, and I think you want to be here when we do.